Evening. This is Mae Brussell in Carmel, California, and Pacific Grove, California. It's broadcast number 549, June the 14th, 1982. I have to get used to the city. We've moved from Carmel to Pacific Grove. Every broadcast begins with a tape number, in case you wondered. I've been on the air 11 years. I lost count some way. It really should be 572, but way back in the early time period, I lost track of the numbers. If I go out of town, I make broadcasts ahead of time and date them so that there's a continuous series of broadcasts, and I haven't lost 1 week in the past 11 years. Oh, 1 week I did, but that's a long story. I had a guest who fainted in the room after the first 5 minutes, and that didn't work out very well. The result of changing stations was very rewarding for me personally because of the response of people. It made me feel that some seeds have been planted, that people have understood what I've been trying to say, and I appreciate your response. There have been telephone calls for about 10 days, and everybody had something wonderful to say, and most of all, it was a broad range of people, young, old, all ages. It wasn't just the older people. This was explained at the other station. It wasn't that at all. And there were wonderful kinds of messages of what people have learned, and that was encouraging. I do want to say that there was another station here very close to this station, Roger Powers, who did offer me to go on K-Ocean. And the reason I mention it is that Roger is a very conservative person politically. It's a privately owned station. Kazoo, the station that I am with now, that I decided to accept this invitation to be at this station, is a listener-sponsored station. But the spectrum of people listening or appreciating the research crossed over both ways, from the extreme right, if I can say that about Roger, to the left, or the group of people that are concerned with a broad range of changes taking place in our society and are willing to invest their time and energy to try and make these changes. It was heartening to see the stereotypes disappear and the kinds of people that responded to the kind of work I've done. I receive mail from you. I answer every letter. If you have questions about the broadcast, I'm listed in the telephone book. I'll answer your questions if they seem controversial to you and there's a new audience. Sometimes the names are confusing. I can't explain all of the names to you, but I can give you sources of information and books to read. Tape cassettes are available going back to 1977, March 1977. The motive or the purpose of my research is to watch history unfold, to explain who are the people moving right now, the nuclear weapons, the large missiles, the space stations. Who are the people controlling our government, and primarily with the weapons, because those are the things that are so dangerous. This is the week of demonstrations, nuclear discussions of the United Nations, and I'm sure that a whole generation that grew up during the 60s remember Monterey Pomp and the Woodstock generation, and it must have been very heartening to see the kind of demonstration in New York City this last week. They said there were 500,000. In the newspaper, people that were there said it was closer to 750,000 or 1 million people. And there were some of the rock stars of the 60s, Joan Baez, James Taylor, Linda Ronstadt, Paul Simon. But the feeling there was that same kind of energy that started in the 60s before hard drugs and the mafia and the COINTEL program of Richard Nixon came in and smashed up what was a beautiful thing. And it was very encouraging for people back there to get to know each other and see people from all over the country. And what started in California, and this was really a grassroots California experience, where people left their homes in the East and came out to Haight-Ashbury, and then down the coast and down Big Sur and Monterey, and all up north to various wooded areas on the West Coast. What started as a movement out here has spread across the country, so that Woodstock phenomena has spread south to New York and in Central America and the Middle America, and the middle class now is out there objecting to the warfare system, the warfare state. so that the ideas that began in the 60s during the Vietnam War are not over. People are out on the streets in San Francisco and the local area, children, backpacks, they demonstrated before, and they're visible again. Now, there's two things that you have to do to preserve this planet. One is be visible and go to the demonstrations and be seen. It's terribly important to be seen, to let the power structure know that you're alive and that you care. And the second thing is that you have to be educated. Information is a weapon, and you have to use it. And that's my role in sharing my research with you and being on the air all these years and writing and so forth, is that if you're not educated to the people behind the power structure, you'll get more of the same, only worse, as the years go on. After the Vietnam War, people assumed the war was over and went back to whatever they had to do. And William Colby, who ran the Phoenix program and claimed at his confirmation hearings that he had killed 30 or 40,000 people and was notorious in the torture chambers over in Southeast Asia, became the director of the CIA at home. Well, if he had the expertise over there and he comes home and uses that same expertise here, you can expect more of it around the world. So the main thing that I want to stress, and I always have mentioned, is that being visible is important. Writing letters, getting on radio talk shows, listening to other people express their research, read books on the subject, and then become knowledgeable, because in order to survive, you have to do both. It's impossible to know it in your head and not get out there in some way in front of the people. That will not make any impression, and it's not wise to be out on the streets demonstrating and being physically seen and then not knowing who is in control of the government. And more important, how they got there. That's the main thing. Because the area that I've researched for almost 20 years now has to do with the way these people take power in this country and assume power in other countries, specifically through murder and assassinations. And I've always believed that if we could pin them down to those acts which they in fact did, we could remove them from power and then start all over and insist that we don't have criminals, war criminals, Nazi war criminals, murderers running the White House. It has been my allegation for many, many years that there was a coup d'etat in Dallas, Texas, November 22nd, 1963, and that all the people that have been in control ever since, the main people, can go right back to that date, that time and place, and were a part of that history and had some part of the murder of John Kennedy or the cover-up of the murder. And they are causing so much trouble in the world today, and many of them are still alive and very powerful. And these are the people that I constantly try to expose for what they're doing today, and then take you back to the time when they were involved in Dallas in the killing of John Kennedy or Robert Kennedy or Reverend Martin Luther King or Malcolm X. And in fact, I believe we have death squads in this country similar to Brazil and Argentina, and they've been responsible for thousands of deaths. Now, one matter before I go on this evening, the bulk of the evening is going to be on Watergate. It's the 10th anniversary of Watergate. Great Britain captured Alfredo Astiz down in the Falklands at South Georgia. He was signed down there. He is a known torturer, murderer, killing the left-wing guerrillas and their sympathizers and rounding up people as a double agent. He has been written about in Amnesty International. The French want him for killing nuns. The Swedish want him for murder, besides people in Argentina. The British brought him home to Great Britain, and this week they released him, and he's on his way back to Argentina. I understand why they do it, because I believe that Margaret Thatcher and Ronald Reagan are fascists, and they don't care if these people are killing members of the poorer class, the labor leaders, the farmers, the people that want to educate and organize themselves. They released him. He is a rotten person, and he should have been sent to the countries that wanted him for the murders. In the issue of Covert Action, this is March 1982, they have an article, Argentina activates its international death squads. That doesn't mean they stopped them. They activated them, even though the top people in our government have been playing with the Argentine junta all along and encouraged them for the actions they've been doing. And this article says the blonde angel, remember the angel of death at Auschwitz? Well, he's the blonde angel, Lieutenant Astis. There's a picture of him in Covert Action, this last issue that came out in March. He infiltrates citizens groups. He's responsible for a place called La Escuela, translated the school. They have over 4,700 men, women, and children that were arrested there, and only 100 survived. He's in charge of torture, of disappearing children, and infiltrating groups, kidnapping, and torture. He was picked up at Pretoria June 20th, 1979 as a naval attaché, and instead of turning him over to the countries where he could be tried for the crimes, he's going to be back in Argentina doing the same thing he did before and doing it well, and the Allies have allowed him to return. This is one reason it's so hard to get a handle on these various people when you catch them, such as Adolf Eichmann, who the Americans had after World War II, and then let him go down to South America, or Joseph Mengele or Martin Bormann. We are breeding these people down there for decapitations, for mass murder, for killing the native population, the Indian populations throughout all South America and Central America. And the blood is part of the responsibility of people like Ronald Reagan and Margaret Thatcher, because they had him and they returned him, and it's a real tragedy. Now, this is the 10th anniversary of Watergate, and I have a lot of fond memories of the entire era of Watergate. I'm going to run down some important dates for you, because there is no explanation 10 years later of Watergate that holds as well as what I wrote within 3 weeks after the rest of the Watergate Hotel. There's been hundreds and hundreds of books on Watergate. CBS is doing a program this week on Watergate. The people who made this production came in from Texas. It's produced by Dallas oil man Bill Moses and Nancy Dickerson. They were at the Watergate Hotel last week. There was a party, and they were the guests. They made the movie 784 Days That Changed America. But at the party were Chief Justice and Mrs. Warren Burger, our Attorney General and his wife, William French Smith, CIA Director Bill Casey, and the German ambassador and his wife, and the British ambassador and his wife, and other people. So the hierarchy from Germany and Great Britain and the United States CIA and the Chief Justice attended a party given by Baron H.H. Thyssen, born Amizia, from Switzerland and Germany, with his Brazilian wife at the Watergate Hotel. So 10 years later, they're laughing at us, and goodness knows they have reason to laugh, because my explanation of Watergate when it happened was that it was a change of power in the United States, and I wasn't original in this. I'll give you the sources of information in case some of you don't remember this. But the purpose was to slide out Richard Nixon and get Spiro Agnew in as president, representing the real military junta, the fascist element of the United States. Nixon caught on and pulled the rug out from Agnew, and then put in his pal Jerry Ford, who was also on the Warren Commission to cover up the murder of John Kennedy. Nixon was in Dallas the day John Kennedy was murdered, and there was a transition of power, namely to Alexander Haig, Henry Kissinger, and the Pentagon totally took over the White House from that time on. Now, Watergate really began June 13th, 1971, as far as I was concerned. That's when the Pentagon Papers came out. They told about how the government lied in Southeast Asia, how we were in collusion with the murder of Diem and his brother-in-law and brother. The American government had concealed the war in Southeast Asia and the plans for a long time. So the Pentagon Papers came out June 13th, 1971, and I started doing my broadcasting that same week to do an interpretation of the Pentagon Papers and what they meant. And I said at that very first broadcast 11 years ago that the meaning of the Pentagon Papers was the continuous process not only of killing Diem, but John Kennedy a month later, and the same people that killed him killed the President of the United States, and that the war was another method of controlling Southeast Asia, a political plan that had started since World War II, and the murder of Kennedy fit right into the same operators of the Pentagon Papers that were described. Interesting enough, at the time of Watergate, when the men were arrested, E. Howard Hunt had on his desk a razor with glue and tapes, the State Department top-secret documents, and he was forging them to say that John Kennedy was responsible for the murder of Diem. So our taxpayers were giving him $100 a day in the White House with scissors and glue to change the history around and make Kennedy a murderer posthumously. Now, the influence of the Pentagon Papers caused Louis Tackwood, the police agent from Los Angeles Criminal Conspiracy Section, to come forward and meet with Don Freed and other researchers in Los Angeles. And at the Los Angeles Press Club, October 25th, 1971, Tackwood explained at that press conference that the Squad 19 in San Diego at the time of the conventions was going to kidnap the anti-war protesters. They were going to cause mass violence with the possibility of killing Richard Nixon down there, and that his agents in the White House were a Mr. Martin and a Mr. White, and that the Los Angeles Police Department was controlled by the CIA and the FBI, and he wanted out. He didn't want any part of this violence. He was influenced by the Pentagon Papers and what Daniel Ellsberg said. So at the press conference, he talked about the espionage squad in the White House, about Mr. Martin and Mr. White, and the murders and violence that were going to be planned in 1972, and the hiring of provocateurs. And after Watergate arrests, all this turned out to be true. And there was an article in the New York Times that covered the press coverage, and Leroy Aarons of the Washington Post. But it really was silence with the news media, and nothing more was said about that, even though he was trying to tell this country what was going on. And simultaneously, in 1971, while he was saying this, Henry Kissinger took over the National Security Council. Richard Nixon had made him chief of the National Security, and he began to redesign the whole National Security Council and the White House to his own liking. He took over literally the State Department, the Defense Department, and the Central Intelligence Agency. And Henry Kissinger, who was doing all that, had been working with Nelson Rockefeller and David Rockefeller and had catapulted his career from Harvard to the National Security Council when Richard Nixon came to power. So what Louis Tackwood was talking about was indeed happening simultaneously in 1971 in the White House. Kissinger had moved in, and if you notice with all the Watergate stories, Kissinger and Haig come out as the great saviors of the administration, not as the betrayers. They come out on top, still interviewed in the news as if they did something great. Now, June 17th, 1972, it'll be 10 years ago this week, the men were arrested at the Watergate Hotel. 5 men were arrested, and 9 were registered at the hotel. And when it was James McCord went to the police station, he got himself registered as Mr. Martin. And the men had in their pocket at the time the name of Mr. White. So I knew immediately that this was the team that Louis Tackwood was talking about. I had contacted him after his press conference in 1971 because if he worked for the police department in L.A., he might know who was behind the murder of Robert Kennedy because he was working for them at the same time. So I was in touch with Louis Tackwood and Don Freed up to the time of the arrest at Watergate. And the minute they were arrested, I picked up the telephone and called Bernard Fensterwald, an attorney in Washington, D.C., who works for the CIA, who had been in Carmel, California, at my home for 3 days. And I said, you know who they caught last night? And he said, who? I said, I know he knows who, but I said, it's the men who killed John Kennedy. Those are the guys. They caught him at the Watergate Hotel. Well, it was 9 months later when James McCord broke the story with Judge John Sirica, and he presented his attorney, Bernard Fensterwald, and then began to unfold the whole story that I had written about in the meantime in my Realist article about the changeover of the government. I had written a story on the plans of a coup in the country, the plans to kill Richard Nixon, and the threats to our freedom, as I say, kidnapping people and taking them away, that there was this inside team that was planning a military coup d'etat. As a matter of fact, in E. Howard Hunt's desk, there were wire, walkie-talkies, wire equipment, radio equipment, a gun in his desk at the White House. He had all the accoutrements of a coup and road maps of Washington and streets to cut off, and this was part of his operation inside the White House that they were planning for that fall at the time of the conventions. Now, the White House tapes came out after a long time after I'd published my article, But there are several comments that I just want to share with you now that are interesting. June 20th, 1972. The arrest was June 17th. And Charles Colson was talking to Richard Nixon, and Colson was saying, I was thinking about this past weekend, what happened, and I figured maybe it's the Cubans that did it, meaning the Watergate problems. Organizing it on their own, they had the, and then there's unintelligible. Then Richard Nixon said, I saw a paper when I was in there, and it says Kennedy. Oh, he was a public enemy number one for those Cubans. And Colson said, oh, they're violent. Mr. President, most of them keep. And that was it. John Kennedy was the number one target of the Cubans. And Richard Nixon, 3 days after the Watergate arrest, was probably worrying about his own life and what the Cubans would do for him. They had been brought up to Washington for the funeral of J. Edgar Hoover in May, a month before, for demonstrations, and turned out to be pretty violent. And Richard Nixon was worrying 3 days after the arrest about the Cubans and their violence and John Kennedy's demise. And then in the same conversation, June 20th, 1972, he was talking some more about the Bay of Pigs, and he refers to members of the Watergate burglary squad who had been recruited from the Cuban exile community in Miami by E. Howard Hunt. He's talking with Charles Colson. E. Howard Hunt was the White House aide at the CIA who assisted with the Bay of Pigs operation and all these various Cubans. Mr. Colson, a friend of Mr. Hunt's, said he found it hard to believe that Mr. Hunt was involved in the Watergate matter because of the way it was botched. He's just too damn shrewd. And Nixon said, it doesn't sound like a skillful job. If we didn't know better, I would have thought it was deliberately botched. So 3 days after the arrest, Nixon is catching on that maybe it was deliberately botched. This was in June. And by August, 2 months later, Spiro Agnew was being investigated. And I'm sure this was what instigated this was a suspicion that Agnew would take his place. So he wanted to make sure to get him out. So by August the 6th, 2 months later, Elliot Richardson told Richard Nixon that he was beginning the investigation on his vice president. Now, the judge who prosecuted Agnew defended his decisions just last year, and he said the reason he did it, and he broke his silence, the federal judge in Virginia, he said there was the possibility that he would be a president, and he had to block his presidency. So as soon as the men were arrested at Watergate, one of the first things on tape that Richard Nixon was worrying about was the people that killed Kennedy. And keep in mind that Louis Tackwood said they were planning to kill Nixon. And if they couldn't kill him, they could slide him out with a piece of tape, and that worked just as well. The transfer of power actually took place because they taped the president and botched this burglary and linked the two and then produced the tapes. And Nixon caught on. He worried about who killed Kennedy. He worried about the Cubans. He thought it could be deliberately botched. He pulled the rug out of Agnew 2 months later, and then the judge, just in October the 4th, 1980, said the reason he decided to let him cop a plea of no contest was that it blocked the possible Agnew presidency. So there was a power grab going on all this time. Now, simultaneously with this, in May of 72, this was 2 months before the Watergate arrests, the acting director of the FBI was sending memos out about the danger of John Lennon, that he was a danger to this country. And I have an FBI report dated May 25th. And Mr. Sciano, the head of Immigration Services, wrote to the FBI, and he advised that he considered requesting them to put a hold on Yoko Ono and John Lennon and go ahead with the deportation proceedings because they received information that the Lennons were planning a large rock concert in Miami. Now, the reason I'm throwing the Lennons into this story was that in May, before the Watergate story broke, before they were arrested, the Lennons were a threat to the establishment for the serious crime of a rock concert in Miami. And then I have another FBI report in June. This is June the 5th, and the Watergate arrest began June 17th. And they advised again of the danger of the Lennons, that Lennon and his wife are planning a rock concert in Miami at the time of the conventions, and they were going to try and get them out of the country. Well, when the men were arrested at the Watergate Hotel, I began my article, a 3-part article. Many of you have it. Some of you don't. It was called Why Was Martha Mitchell Kidnapped? And it's the story of the actual kidnapping of Martha Mitchell that was verified by James McCord later, and the importance of injecting her, the Attorney General's wife, and keeping and promoting the men who did this to her instead of firing them or investigating it. And it was a 3-part link of American assassinations and how Richard Nixon really came to power by bringing Nazis into this country. It covered, this article in The Realist, a large spectrum of American history going back to the end of World War II and right up to Watergate and the injection and the kidnapping of the Attorney General's wife. Well, when Paul Krasner got the article, I worked for 3 weeks, night and day. I didn't do anything else but that. He had no money to get the Realist out. He was broke. He was living on the West Coast. He had 100,000 readers. He had no money. And he was in San Francisco, and he knew Yoko Ono from earlier in New York City from the art galleries and different activities he was in. And Yoko and John put up the $5,000 to get this story out. And that's how my first published article came out. It turned out later that the State Department fellow, the immigration official who was deporting the Lennons, resigned on the basis that the deportation proceedings protected Nazis in America, and specifically Nikolai Malaksa of the Iron Guard, and wanted to deport the Lennons. And the same fellow who was involved in the deportation was furious for the Immigration and State Department for combining the Lennons into the Nazi war criminals, and he left the State Department. And the Nikolai Malaksa, of course, was the man who came to Richard Nixon's office at Whittier. He had a dummy front called Western Tube, and that was the same Nazi team of the Iron Guard that Richard Nixon was bringing to his office. Now, right after they put up the money for this article, there was another FBI report on the Lennons. This is dated August the 30th. That they not only were giving a rock concert in Miami, but now they were linked to the New Left. It says, for the past several months, there's been information received to indicate that the subject is active in the New Left. Well, Paul Krasner had instigated and given the title to the Yippies at the Chicago conventions, but after we had gotten together with the Lennons, they'd put up the article. I had a meeting at the LA Press Club where I presented my Watergate story on the planned coup in America to tighten up the military control of this country. As soon as they got involved with us, they were targets of the immigration that they were New Left. But I also think it protected their being in this country, because then on the basis of national security, their past files were locked up, but they weren't deported, and they were allowed to come and go to this country. So there was something to be saved about this. I'm going to take a 1-minute break now and come back with some more on the history of Watergate and how the power changed hands at that time. Now back to the second half of World Watchers. On the anniversary of Watergate, what I'm trying to show for you, and will in the next half hour, maybe for the next few weeks, is that there was this internal rearrangement in the Intelligence Department, in the State Department, in the National Security Council, and Henry Kissinger had moved himself into the White House and then was invited to become Secretary of State. And after the Watergate tapes began to unfold, Richard Nixon was out and Alexander Haig was really running the country. Now, Alex Butterfield was in Australia. He was a member of a military family, third-generation military man. His grandfather was a West Pointer, his father a Navy pilot. He worked with Alexander Haig, and he was down in Australia at the time that Nixon came to power. And Haig brought him up to the White House, where he very conveniently taped the President of the United States. Now, you remember that the Supreme Court said that Richard Nixon should turn over 9 tapes, and then there were 7, and then there was unintelligible, and they brought in a fellow, Gordon Novell, to electronically erase tapes, and Robert Haldeman took tapes home. And, of course, that would erase any mention. It's funny, in all these tapes, you know, the Kissinger and the Haig role in this. But as Richard Nixon began to look sillier and sillier and got phlebitis and went to the hospital, Alexander Haig left his role in the Pentagon. He had worked with the U-2 flight over the Soviet Union, the Gary Powers flight with Allen Dulles. That was the flight. Lee Harvey Oswald was in the Soviet Union at the Minsk radio factory, and Gary Powers thought he had a role in downing that. That broke off the détente, the rapprochement between Khrushchev and Eisenhower. It was a terrible event of American history. Every time there's a chance for peace, this same team are always there, and Alexander Haig was there. So all of a sudden, at the hearings, the Senate hearings, Mr. Butterfield steps forward, July 13th, 1973, and they asked him, Judge Sirica, did you in fact tape the presidents? So that Butterfield, with his military background of 3 generations, and he also was put in charge of federal aviation to investigate the Dorothy Hunt plane crash when the main primary witness went falling in the sky over Chicago, and her name appears in the early tapes over and over again. Butterfield was brought in by Haig. He bugged the president and tape recorded, and I'm sure, as I say, to their own convenience, could raise what they didn't want. Alexander Haig, by way of those tapes, eased the president out. The president didn't trust Spiro Agnew, so he had Jerry Ford come in. Jerry Ford had been called by the president to go to Wright Patman, who deceased shortly afterwards, and they were going to open up the banking connections, and Jerry was called in to cover that. And his reward, of course, for all the years from being on the Warren Commission and covering the murder of John Kennedy and all this can of worms that were in the White House at the time, because all these people went back to the murder of John Kennedy, and they're all sitting there making this smooth transition of power of the German Henry Kissinger, his mentor Fritz Kramer. I did many, many weeks this past year on Fritz Kramer, and I'll be doing a lot more in the next weeks to come for you. A German running the State Department, the Pentagon decisions, and the wars that we've been into, and the rearmament, and the weapon systems that getting ready for World War III by 1985. Fritz Kramer and the Pentagon had 2 proteges of absolute power. One's Alexander Haig, and one was Henry Kissinger. So Haig took over the White House, and Kissinger took over the National Security Council and then became Secretary of State. Kramer was sitting there in the Pentagon pulling the switches, and then what happened was that Nixon goes home with his head between his legs and recuperates financially, but not spiritually, I'm sure. Gerald Ford is the holdover while these people can retrench and set up their next strategy. But the chain of command, the thing that I wrote about in my article on the coup d'etat that was continuing, was true then, and it's true now, because it's 10 years later, and you can look back at the continuity. What I said was happening indeed did happen, and I was writing it 10 years ago. As a matter of fact, at the press club, at the LA Press Club, this was in August the 8th, 1970, right after the arrest. And as I say, the system began to become unglued by March of 73. I had a large chart behind me, and if any of you want it, I'll send it to you. You can write to me and send a self-addressed stamped envelope. My address is in the book, or you can write Box 22511, Carmel 93922. I'll give that to you if I remember at the end of the show. At the press conference in August, and this was just weeks after the arrest, I had a 3-prong chart at the top, and the center was the White House with Richard Nixon, and under that, the CIA control of Mr. Martin. That was James McCord, 19 years with the CIA, and he was in charge of the 16-man emergency team if they had a coup with the walkie-talkies, and under him, Bernard Barker, who was in charge of the conduit of funds for Watergate and planning the violent demonstrations in Miami, similar to the ones in Chicago in 1968. On the left-hand side of the chart, I had John Mitchell, the chairman of the Re-election Committee, and under him, G. Gordon Liddy, the former White House staff counsel, and under him, the Robert Bennett Associate, which is the public relations office across the street from the White House, where there was $10 million put in by the Howard Hughes organization into the Mullen Associates for the takeover that was to take place at the time of the convention in 1972. Now, the Howard Hughes people had long been controlled by direct links to Nazi Germany. In the first Watergate article, I was linking Nixon to the Nazis. The Public Relations Office of Carl Boyer, Byoir, ran the Howard Hughes Organization, their public relation. Boyer was also the public relations for the Flick Company from Nazi Germany, Nazi criminals, and also they combined with J. Peter Grace, who recently got an appointment by Ronald Reagan to cut some more of your benefits and cut federal expenses off the back of the poor, and linked to Otto Ambrose and I.G. Farben. The money that went into Mullen Associates was directly linked to Nazi Germany, the present time and the past Nazi Germany, and of course G. Gordon Liddy with his German indoctrination to Hitler when he was younger through a housekeeper, and his love of Adolf Hitler fit right into the Mullen Associates with E. Howard Hunt and their close links to Richard Helms and his indoctrination in Nazi Germany. I had a diagram on the right-hand side of Charles Colson being the case officer for Mr. White, E. Howard Hunt, and I had a complete diagram within weeks of the Watergate arrest of the power structure as it was, and it hasn't changed that much. Recently, they're still in power. Now, March 19th, 1973 was the date that James McCord went before Judge Sirica and broke the story. He said that people wanted him to plead guilty and end the case, but he said, members of my family fear for my life. He was getting death threats for Mr. Caulfield and other people, and they also got the lesson of the Dorothy Hunt plane crash the December before. So there were primary witnesses of Watergate that were dying like flies, and I'll put some of those on the air for you next week in case you don't remember them. He told the judge there was political pressure to plead guilty, that people had perjured themselves, that other people were involved in Watergate that weren't identified, that the Watergate operation was not a CIA operation, that his motives were different than other people, and that he wanted to speak to the judge out of the chambers. He said, I can't talk with FBI people in the room. I can't talk before the grand jury, the U.S. attorneys, the Department of Justice. He told Judge Sirica, I don't trust any of them. Now, what made Watergate come unglued? A lot of people thought James McCord had left a piece of tape on. When one piece was removed, another tape was put back. James McCord was important in breaking it open for the judge, but who gained? Henry Kissinger and Alexander Haig, who still have power today. McCord was different than the other people, but he not only worked for the CIA, he worked for the Department of Defense, for the emergency, 16-member emergency contingency. And at the time, Ronald Reagan out here had been charged of the Garden Plot and the coups d'etats that were planned. He was governor in California until 1974, 1968 to 74. And he had his finger, there's minutes of these meetings on the planned coup d'etat, and that would have served him fine. He would have worked his way up eventually anyway. So that James McCord, an outsider, was breaking this story that was sure to get Richard Nixon out of the office, to bring in Jerry Ford and bring Haig into the White House, and the old team would move out. There was Butterfield working with Alexander Haig, and there was James McCord working with the Pentagon and the emergency unit, and he wanted to protect the CIA. He didn't want them to take all the blame, but he never fingered the Defense Department. But he was willing to break that story so that two people from the inside were breaking this story, and the House was falling down, and Richard Nixon was out of place, but the power structure stayed the same. Now, when James McCord went to testify, this was May the 17th, 1973, before Judge Sirica, he brought his counsel, Bernard Fensterwald. As I say, Fensterwald had been at my home before this all came down, and I had called him at the time they were arrested. There were three people that I was in touch with simultaneously while all this was happening. One was the experience with John and Yoko Lennon, who were victims of the system, who were to be deported while the top Nazis and murderers were to stay here. The other was Louis Tackwood, who had clued in to the people in the White House, and they, in fact, were the ones arrested, and I was in touch with him in Los Angeles, and Bernard Fensterwald, who became James McCord's attorney. So Watergate wasn't a phenomenon that I studied like the John Kennedy assassination, starting from scratch, trying to figure things out for myself. I had already been on the air 1 year. I knew these characters that were involved. I knew where to look for the story, what they had done in the past, and that's why it was easy. It wasn't easy. It was hard to get the story together, but it was easier than most people because I was able to pull out the early Tackwood allegations from 1971 and was in touch with people who had a finger in the pie. Fensterwald knew what McCord was. He was a double agent who went around the country meeting researchers on the pretense that he ran a committee to investigate assassinations, but his links were closer to Carlos Marcello and Bobby Vesco than they were to truth, and he became McCord's attorney. Now, before the hearings in May, McCord made it very clear. He said that he wanted to open up this story, and he wanted more truths to come out. He said that the freedoms were involved, and he said, if it meant my freedom, if I had to go to jail, I would do it, but I wasn't going to see the CIA blamed. And then he went on to say that he would burn every tree in the forest. He threatened. He sent a letter to Jack Caulfield. He says, if this gets out of hand, if the Watergate case gets out of hand, I will burn every tree. He said, every tree in the forest will fall. It will be a desert. The whole matter is at the precipice right now. And that's the message. If you want to blow it, go on and do it. This is what he testified May the 17th, 1973, that if you want to push me too far, the operation will fall down and every tree in the forest will fall and it will be a desert. Now, McCord wasn't pushed. He only had 4 months in jail. He's now at Fort Collins, Colorado, which is an interesting phenomenon, but I won't digress to that right now. And he put on the line, don't mess around with me because I know what's going on for the last years. And when I wrote my article, I didn't know what he was threatening back there. I had published the article in August of 72, and this is May of 73. But I knew he went back with a long history of espionage and counterintelligence. And here's a fellow telling Judge Sirica, and on public television it was recorded, his threats. And E. Howard Hunt said the same thing. He threatened, and this was quoted May 17th, 1973 at the hearings, Hunt purportedly threatened to blow the White House out of the water. Mrs. Hunt at one point repeated the statement and made it before E. Howard Hunt and said she had enough information to impeach the president. Well, Mrs. Hunt was blown up in a plane crash in December. She never got around to what she had, but she was threatening to impeach the president of the United States. And this is just days after their arrest. I'm busy in Carmel writing my article, Why Was Martha Mitchell Kidnapped? And these dogs back there are really frantic. And it was fun later, after my published article came out, to read the Watergate hearings, to hear them on television, to read the transcripts, to read the books, because here's Richard Nixon thinking that it's deliberate. Here's Nixon pulling the rug out of Agnew. Here's the worrying that the Cubans are killers. He knows they are. He's thinking about Kennedy. He's thinking about himself. Hunt's threatening to blow the White House out of the water, and McCord is threatening to burn every tree in the forest. Now, what in the heck are they so worried about? I mean, 5 men caught at a hotel wiretapping a telephone? No, that couldn't be what it was at all. And nothing else in the last 10 years has pointed out the consistency of the people who planned the coup that Louis Tackwood talked about and how they did, in fact, take hold of this government in the past 10 years. As a matter of fact, in that first published article, I said the line of succession in this country was Richard Nixon, Spiro Agnew, and Ronald Reagan. Those were the 3 heirs to the Nazi regime from 1945. When the war was over, they were groomed for it, and we'll go many times, as I have in the past, in the future, giving you the exact dates of the takeover of when this country was sold out. So this strong language of these guys, the president, and there's hours of conversations, and he's pretty nervous. So we got him worried. We've got Haig taking over as chief of staff. Haldeman slipped out, and a general who passed over 243 people gets a big, fast promotion, and he's in there in the White House. Remember, nobody elected Kissinger, nobody elected Haig. Here comes Gerald Ford out of nowhere, covering up the murder of a president of the United States, and here's a gang of crooks scrambling to cover their bases, but worried, threatening each other. And as I say, they weren't just threatening because some men were arrested, and one of them had the name White, and it was E. Howard Hunt in the White House. There were so many things coming unglued, and life threats to people, and people being murdered, like Beverly Kay, who typed up that 18-minute gap in the White House, and Murray Chotiner, the man behind both Richard Nixon and Chief Justice Earl Warren. there are a whole group of people, Lou Russell, who worked with the House Un-American Activities, who was killed. There were 30 deaths almost immediately, and the most frightening was the Dorothy Hunt crash. And later it came out that Tony Laswitz was up at Chappaquiddick the night that Mary Jo Kopechne was killed, and that knocked Senator Ted Kennedy out of the chances of being a president of the United States. They could always bring this out. This gang was scrambling around, and I had published an article. Now, the LA Free Press, and I have copies here of newspaper articles from the LA Free Press, from San Francisco papers, from the Berkeley Barb, the counterculture, which we're missing today. There is no such thing as these little papers anymore where the truth could come out, like the LA Star. They all closed. The Berkeley Barb's closed, the LA Star closed, the LA Free Press, the Boston papers, the Detroit papers, the Philadelphia. The alternative paper that's so badly needed is gone. And that's why it's always been a challenge to me and a responsibility for me to be on the air these 11 years, because this is practically the only continuing radio program of its kind probably in the world and in this country, trying to alert you to things that could be in the alternative press that were all closed up. And I hope that one thing that comes out of the anti-nuclear movement and the fear of World War III is that there will be the emergence of the small press again. Now, at the press conference in L.A., in addition to this chart, the subject was carried by Art Fine in the L.A. Free Press, and I'll give you some excerpts of what he was saying about the article, not what I said in my article, so you could see what he was saying in this 10 years ago, the anniversary of Watergate. He said, "Big news is coming out of Monterey Bay lately, but it isn't Monterey. A journalist living in Carmel has broken a story which could have reverberations around the world. Many people are concerned with conspiracies." He goes on, there's some uncertainty, there's some skepticism, but in August 1982 in The Realist, she presented an article on the kidnapping of Martha Mitchell, the CIA participation in it, in the plans for civil disorders, for political assassinations. He mentions that Paul Krasner publishes The Realist, that he's usually a satirist, but he took this issue of The Realist and presented something serious, that she's on Saturday, and it mentioned the radio station in Carmel, California, had been on for a year. This article went into the Louis Tackwood allegations of the planned coup in this country, of Mr. Martin and Mr. White, and May offered these opinions. Now, this was 10 years ago. One, the CIA plotted the murder of John Kennedy, Robert Kennedy, Martin Luther King, and the shooting of George Wallace. Two, the CIA financed the 1967 military takeover in Greece as a practice run for similar takeover in the United States. Three, Lee Harvey Oswald was an agent of Navy intelligence. Four, the 600 Nazi agents were brought to the United States before the end of World War II and placed in defense and aerospace. I'm reading this to you because many of you don't realize when I talk about these things that 10 years ago, 10 years before 60 Minutes, on a radio station in this city and on other radio stations around the country, this program is taped for them. This is what I was publishing. The article said, "The CIA is the device of an international conspiracy that is manipulating the policies of the United States and other countries." Now, of course, when Nixon was in power and Allende won the election in Chile, the orders of Kissinger and Allende were get him out, put Pinochet in. So you see, I was writing 10 years ago how we were doing coups, and I had a list up to that time. And then I was mentioning this was up till 1972, and goodness knows how many heads of states we've murdered since that time. I wrote that Martha Mitchell was detained and drugged by 5 men rather than her usual guard, that 4 men were at large at the time of the Watergate, and they could have been out there, and that L. Patrick Gray was staying out at the same place as the Mitchells simultaneously. Now, later it turned out that L. Patrick Gray was ordered to Deep Six and destroy papers about the Watergate that would have proved a much larger conspiracy. Maurice Stans, who's been appointed as a special commission job by Ronald Reagan, now was at the committee to reelect the president, shredding papers. The moving vans came in and took the files out of the White House that belonged to Howard Hunt, the Chappaquiddick files, the DM files. They were scrambling around, and I was making allegations about these people while they were destroying their evidence. I wrote about the $10 million in funds that made its way into the CIA and then came back to the reelection of Richard Nixon. Now, there was an article in the New York Times, June the 10th, 1974. This is 2 years after my article, saying that the CIA had diverted millions of dollars of taxpayers' money to the political goal of reelecting the president. Now, I posed the question at the time of the press conference and in my article, if the CIA is pouring money into the president, tax dollars, and we don't choose him for president, how can the people opposing him have equal money? If it goes into the till and then all the CIA people are putting it into his reelection, and that, in fact, was what was happening, and it was in the New York Times, the Sam Ervin panel, as I say, June 10th, 1974, from the General Services Administration, from the Office of Minority Business Enterprise. The minorities were supposed to be getting money for small businesses, and the money was diverted to the Richard Nixon supporters, so the minorities weren't getting it. Department of Health, Education, and Welfare, money that was allocated to them 2 years later, it turned out was going to the reelection of Richard Nixon and their criminal activities. And then this article goes on with some more allegations I made at the press conference. There was a fairly good analysis of what I said, and the essence was picked up by the LA Free Press. I give them credit for that. There was a wall of silence, of course, with the major media. The same people that were at that press conference, such as Leroy Aarons from Washington Post, he covered the Louis Tackwood allegations, and there was nobody to investigate what Tackwood said. Now, if anybody had followed his articles in the New York Times and Washington Post, and the purpose of Tackwood surfacing was to warn people that the government had literally been taken over by the intelligence agencies that wanted a coup d'etat in this country, that they would kill the president if necessary, round up the radicals, take them away. And here was a man who worked with the LAPD for many years. Louis Tackwood, incidentally, is named after Louis Armstrong. That was his godfather, and he came from New Orleans. He even worked with Carlos Marcello, and he's no pansy or sissy. He was somebody to believe. He worked with Donald DeFreeze in the Los Angeles Police Department. That's how I happened to get the first scoop on my article, The SLA is the CIA, because Tackwood knew the story about that. As a matter of fact, in March of 1973, the Watergate story was in limbo. The men were going to plead guilty. My article was published and disseminated around the country. And Louis Tackwood was here in Carmel, California. His book, The Glass House Tapes, was almost ready for the printer. Avon Publisher put it out. It's in a paperback, and it has the allegations about what was going to come down at the Republican conventions. As a matter of fact, he gave me the first copy, they said, of approval for him to read it over, and for the publishers want him to see it, and he autographed it and gave it to me. And he was at my home March 1973 when he got a telephone call, and it was from Don Freed in L.A., that somebody from the Los Angeles Police Department clued him off. They were going to kill him because when McCord started talking, he had said that McCord was Mr. Martin. So they said, get out of town as fast as you can. We had dinner at Gallatan's here in town. I came home, cashed a check, and got $100 rounded up from family and friends, and gave him one of my Rolly cameras. And he was here with his girlfriend, who he later married. And they got out of town as fast as they could, because when McCord broke the story, he thought he would be one of those first 30 that would be wiped out. There was evidence they were after him, and he got out of town. He took a bus and went down to New Orleans, where he had family, and stayed in hiding. And when the press conference came down in August of 72, earlier he was at the LA Press Club. He wasn't allowed to see me. The LAPD had sent orders, don't surface, don't confirm it, stay away, because the newspaper articles that made the connection of what he said in 1971 and what I wrote in 1972, if they saw the two of us together and challenged, how come he said this and it's in your papers and you didn't do anything about it, no one in Washington did anything, and here comes May months later and recognizes the names and writes this article. What is remiss between the reporters who took the stories and did nothing about it and the FBI or the CIA? Well, that's a redundant question. He was talking about a system that is so controlled that the major media locks it up. But the alternative press does expose a lot, or did. And as I say, it's a tragedy that we just don't have that kind of communication. There is a newsletter that Penn Jones has that's been going on all these years, a continuing inquiry. It's a great paper, one of the finest researchers since the day Kennedy was murdered. He has done constant work and dedicated his life to getting out the truth. And there were these other newspapers, too. He's still going. Penn's continuing inquiry is still available. And he also published in his Midlothian Mirror my entire Watergate story. So what I was presenting in that first article, my first published article after 8 years research, and it's 10 years anniversary since that, was that there was a plan to take over the government. This time they couldn't shoot Nixon. And next week I'll go into the man, Andrew Topping, who was hired to shoot Nixon. They did indeed plan that, and Dwight Chapin, the appointment secretary, had approved. He was interviewed. The Secret Service had come to see him. I wrote about Andrew Topping as a man who had an appointment to see Richard Nixon, who could kill him. And just a month ago, Andrew Topping's name was in the news. He was arrested again, and he has a 7-year-old son that he is training to be a mass murderer for the government and the intelligence community. And he tortures and persecutes this little kid and is training him like a Hitler Youth for future assassinations. A case of a woman being turned down and turning in Andrew Topping occurred, and 10 years later his name surfaces in the news, and I published that 10 years ago as a man who had an appointment, and Howard Hunt had a gun in the White House, and it was all a cozy connection. And next week I'm going to do a little bit more about the allegations that I said about Watergate, and then I'm going to update it with what, in fact, did actually happen to show you that, in all modesty, I was exactly on target, and they didn't have to kill Richard Nixon. The power structure took over very nicely. They put the tape there. They slid him out. They got in the very people they wanted. Carter was a holdover, a man from Annapolis who held over till Ronald Reagan could be in the seat. But the blueprint of Tackwood and the article I did 10 years ago happened, and these are the people that are in power today. They did it nicely. Mr. McCord, Mr. Butterfield, Mr. Haig, and now Haig is Secretary of State. Well, this is all for my first evening over here in Pacific Grove. I'll have to get used to the new. It's hard to change the station after so long, but I think it'll be great, and I'm glad to be here, and thank you for the opportunity. In the meantime, this is Mae Brussell in Pacific Grove, and I'll be back with you next week.
Well, good evening out there, kids, and it's time for the blues.